I'm really excited and really pleased to be able to welcome Ian Shears to come and talk to us today. It's probably at least 10 years ago since I first listened to Ian. It was probably a tree net, or not. It has been for at least a decade, probably a lot more than that from behind the scenes. I think Melbourne's been instrumental in that there's been political support. I think at least a couple of the councils, including the current Deputy Mayor, are very strong advocates of the Urban Forest Program and what's happening, which I think that combination means that it works better. You need to have the political support and willpower for these things to work, and then you need the technical knowledge and leadership to make it happen. And I think the team throughout the senior bureaucracy, the council, and Ian and his team have made an incredible development and direction in Melbourne. I was overseas last year at an International Urban Forest Conference, and they were talking about what was happening in Melbourne there. It really is a leading exemplar throughout the world as far as urban forestry programs go. There's an adage that we probably all know, which the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The next best time is now, is today. I think you can probably say the same type of thing about urban forest, in that the best time to plant an urban forest is today, or it was probably 50 years ago, but the next best time is today. And I think Ian's probably leading that, and having done it for 10, 15, 20 years now. Other people in the room have been involved in that for a number of years as well, but I'm looking forward to learning from Ian and hearing an update as to what's going on down there. I think it's an opportunity for us, as a lot of us are consultants, and we work with individual properties a lot of the time. We need to be a part. I don't think any of us realised when we first got involved in arboriculture what was going to happen in this area. The changes that have happened in the last 10, 15, 20 years, because we've gone from just looking after trees to looking after being a part of the strategic urban greening movement that's occurring. And we need to keep up with that. We need to understand what the planning, the strategies are, so that we can reflect that in the work that we do. So thank you very much for making the introduction.
Thank you so much for that kind of introduction and the invitation to come up and share the work. I've sort of been doing this for I think 18 years now at the City of Melbourne, and fortunately sort of had a chance to sort of get up into a managerial position and to lead and to drive a lot of strategic development. And I've just had the great fortune of moving out of a management position sideways into now what is called sort of advice and thought leadership. So going from managing 50 odd people to managing myself has been a great pleasure and a great joy. And what it does enable me is to have time to think and to plan and see the next decade to look like for work, and to spend time coming up to events like this and to share information, to learn and exchange, and to develop networks so that we can all learn from each other. So I'll run through pretty much sort of why we're doing what we're doing, and give you a concept of that urban forest lens. And I think, there's in a sense, there's a single tree view, and then there's a whole of forest view. And so in a way, what we've done is to take a whole of forest view with regards to our municipality, and taken a very holistic view about understanding what the forest contains. So we do a lot about water, about soil, as much about people, as much about trees, ecology, etc. Because I mean, in a sense, whilst trees are probably the most important greening element that we have in our cities, probably the most important element within the forest are the people. So how do we interact? What's the accountability, the fair share, the contribution, the empowerment? And so I'll talk a little bit about engagement as well as the science that sits behind it. So in a way, I'd like to begin this presentation by talking about how we've grown our city. And these are a few slides of Melbourne very early on, as you can see. And this is what's known as the turning basin. This is the Yarra River. And you can see there was the crossing point, the waterfall that occurred at that point. And this must have been a great spot for artists, because these ukes that you can see sitting on the left appear through a number or a series of images. And in some ways, that tree tells us how it thinks and how nature thinks about how we've developed our city. And you can see sort of very quickly on, the tree's quite vocal in terms of what it thinks about the way we've grown our city. And you can see in a short period of time, that's the same location. That's the turning basin there. So you can see that we've sealed off the land. We've disconnected ourselves from the natural processes of nature, which have extraordinary capacity to help and inform the livability of the city and our own health and well-being. So for the work that we do, that's what it used to look like. And that on the left is the space that we're operating. So in terms of thinking about what greening looks like, that's the space that we sort of have. And so in a way we're starting to think, okay, well, what's the potential of the built form to change and to transform, to create a much better space so that we can enable the potential of nature to be unleashed. This is Melbourne. It used to be the most livable city in the world for 7 years. It's now only the second most livable city in the world. Vienna is now the most livable by about 0.02% or something like that. And you can see there we've got the central business district. We've got some of the fantastic parkland with the legacy decisions of Charles the Trobe around 150 years ago. Suburban areas and the Bayside area there, and you look at that and you think, well, that all looks fantastic. Problem is, when I look at that, I see a lot of vulnerability. And we're vulnerable because of changing climate, changing population, densification, a whole range of reasons. So a lot of our work is to consider those challenges and to try and look and confer some resilience to the people in the city that we have. These are just some of those of you who haven't been in Melbourne, sort of new avenue plantings that we've done in Fitzroy Gardens, you know, the 1880s planting of the plane trees in Carlton Gardens, Faulkner Park, the Yarra River, the new park, Burra. So we've inherited some amazing spaces, and we've got some great places to continue to work in, and places like Royal Parade and Swanston Street, Central Spine. So we've got a broad range of typical urban and central city spaces that we're working with. We've inherited the fantastic spots, but one of the concerns that we've got with the densification is that we're losing a lot. And so the red line's our municipal boundary, and if you notice the population figures in green cover, and you look at change over time, you can see that we're losing a lot of our green populations going up. And so this information is just off Landsat, so it's readily available, so you can look at that trend, which I think is a really important thing as we're advocating for change. But we can look at places like Singapore, which over the same period of time has almost doubled its population, but significantly increased its green cover as well. So when we start to think, how do we get that change happening, we look at other cities like Singapore, we look at places like New York, like Chicago, like Berlin, like Malmo, and they've all got really good regulations in place, which mean that when change occurs, greening is a component of that change. So we're in that space of looking at how can we get everybody contributing to that outcome that we want. You know, what's the fair share, what's the accountability that we have. And this is just an example of a recent development in Singapore, and I think the Park Royal Hotel returned 240% green cover on the footprint. So, you know, there are ways that we can do it. You know, we just need to find the recipe for our space so that when change occurs, which is changing all the time, it's good change. And cities around the world have transformed. This is Chongi Chong Stream in Seoul, and you know, whilst it's effective to have a huge freeway, it's much better when it's returned to its natural creekland. And so this gift back to the community is quite extraordinary. So in terms of the health and well-being and the sense of community is awesome. The coolth that radiates sideways on those hot days is really there. Property values have gone up, and this is an art space, and the community just celebrate having their stream returned to them. And those sorts of gestures are really important. These are some from New York, and I love, this is on the Hudson River. And, you know, I love those sort of, planting beautiful trees out on piers. But I like if you can read what's on the fence line there. One need never leave the confines of New York to get all the greenery one wishes. And that's a really nice sort of sentiment to have embedded in the way that they go about doing business there. And this is the High Line, and you can see on the left, the last section that was open, that's what the High Line was like and why the community celebrated it. And remember, the good thing about this story is slightly sort of anarchic, because the town hall wanted to pull the High Line down. The community got together and said, no, this has value, and then they transformed it into this, and that has simply transformed urban settings there and is absolutely world famous. So thinking about Melbourne, and in particular, and I think most cities around the world, these are the key challenges that we've got with extraordinary population growth. urban heating and climate change and all the extremes of weather events that come with that. So how do we go about, understanding what that means and how we take our city forward? And this is roughly our municipal boundary. And if you look down the right-hand or eastern side, you can see all of those beautiful parks that were gifted by Charles Latrobe over 150 years ago from that city planning perspective. If you look down this sort of western side, this is where all our urban growth and change is occurring. So we can't possibly give up that much space. The government just won't support it. So for us, it's thinking, how do we actually get greening in there? What does that look like? And when you look at this plan, you realise and think about land ownership. From a municipal perspective, we only have jurisdiction over about 30% of that footprint. We own, and of that 30%, about 80% is in roadways. So there's sort of limited physical opportunities for us to influence that 30%. So a lot of our work is thinking about how do we influence the other 70%. It's very much the space that we're in. The other thing that it's worth thinking about is how we live in cities is changing. And this is a graph that comes out of a transport strategy, and it's really looking at that modal share, so people moving in and out of the city and how they use existing roads. And so you can see in the future that use of private car is significantly decreasing, but walking, cycling and public transport is coming up. So in a sense, the usage by the community is demanding that we change the way streets function and operate. And that's a really important consideration, because roads are primarily built for vehicles and drainage, but they need to be a lot more. They need to become part of the public realm and shared space. We've had a strong history of extreme weather events, rapidly increasing and coming up with huge loss of lives and economic cost. And so from that climate adaptation perspective, we're realising that we need to act. And so part of the City of Melbourne's key response to climate adaptation is to have a green infrastructure and urban forestry policy as one of its key things. Urban heating and urban heat island you're pretty much aware of. This was one event which occurred back, this was our Black Saturday bushfires, and you might be aware that I think 174 people lost their lives in the fire. What's lesser known is that in the heat wave in the lead up, 373 people lost their lives because of excessive heat. So there isn't a natural disaster that kills more people in Australia than excessive heat. And that's only going to get worse. Climate change is rapidly heating up. This is out of the IPCC report, and it just shows that the number of extreme weather events is changing. And I know the Bureau of Meteorology in Melbourne has got a new colour on its bar chart. Things like that are sort of telling us that heat is coming a lot more and a lot more frequently. And there's been a really interesting series of articles in the Guardian looking at cities and looking at equity. And it's the people that can afford air conditioners that are going to be able to live in cities. And the people that can't afford to pay their power bills will be sleeping on the roofs. So throughout the world, this is becoming a really serious issue, and there's transformation of how we need to be to live in spaces. So you can see misting systems like this, and like this, and like this. So there's technological ways that we can respond, but what it's sort of telling me is that we need to be providing places of refuge, places of coolth in our city. I know with our CBD, on an average day, we get 1 million people in. If we had a brownout and there was no electricity, what on earth happens? How do we look after people? And it's 40 degrees, third day in a row. So that vulnerability from that exposure to heat is extreme. Our transport networks the rails start to buckle on our trains, etc., etc. We had thunderstorm asthma, which killed an extraordinary number of people, and hospital visitations sort of boosted through the roof. And no people that hadn't suffered from asthma suddenly were dying and going into hospital and different things. So there's a lot of unknowns that are out there as well. So there's that sort of Rumsfeld moment. So how do we start to, really decrease the vulnerability and increase the resilience of the community? And our built infrastructure and having green infrastructure is one of the key things. But what do we do? How do we start making those decisions? And most of us know that if we plant a tree, we want it to be there for 100 years or 150 years. What's it going to be like in 100 years' time? And things as simple like these are the elms along Royal Parade. Mean daily temperature in Melbourne, 15 degrees C. We add a few more degrees, and it could be like Mildura, and it's a very different place, and different species are going to work. We add a few more degrees, and it's like Alice Springs. So really enabling us to cast into the future is really important, and I think we need to be looking very carefully at what we do. One of the key pieces of work that we did back in 2011 was to do a useful life expectancy of the majority of the trees. And so here you can see the results. And I was just sort of talking to Gulam before, this is sort of, politically, this is what I often call my shit graph, you know, that really shows what we're going to lose. And it almost sort of says to politicians, you can't do nothing, you have to do something. So this is sort of the basis for garnering that support to really do good work. And if you look at sort of, you know, the heritage landscapes, you know, we could lose a lot of trees in a really short period of time. Now, remembering it's a ULE, it's not a removal date, it's just simply saying these trees aren't going to be that good for that much longer. If we get great rain, it extends out, but we have another millennium drought, it'll shrink right back down again. So, you know, you really need to be aware that this just tells me we need to successionally think about what the future looks like. And from, just to give you an idea, you probably would have all seen these are just typical trees in our major boulevards, St Kilda Road, with very low useful life expectancy. So part of the conversation for us has been educating the community, because the community will look at a tree and see a leaf on it, and it's got value and we need to keep it. Whereas from environmental service provision, whether it's shade, interception of rainfall, air quality, all of those things, these trees aren't doing very much at all. And the drought was something that was really concerning for us. This is Alexandra Park, so you can see on the left and the right, same time of year, but because of the drought. And so this was a huge impact for us. Water restrictions came in, our dams nearly ran dry, and our public landscapes and private landscapes were suffering really badly. And so we had to argue with the government and the water supply companies so we could turn the taps back on so we didn't lose 120-year-old trees. This was a really important cultural shift in thinking that occurred, and quite enabling in a way, and one of the key things that really enabled our strategy to be developed and to think about the work that we did, because we realised whilst we're running out of potable water from our dam system, there's more water that fell on Melbourne as stormwater that was captured by our roads, polluted and put out to the river and the bay that the city used in a whole year. So this whole concept of fit-for-purpose water started to come through, and a real shift, and the investment in our stormwater harvesting systems, which we're now, I think about 26-28% of our green space irrigation comes from captured and clean stormwater. So a shift in the way we think about the city and our city, and it starts to become a lot more integrated. Some of you may know a guy called Andy Vitkus, who runs Tree People over in the US. And he's got a couple of great slides that he shows in his presentation, and he shows the forest, and he talks about all of the services that the forest provides. And then he shows us what a city looks like. Because we've cut down the forest, we need to have a dozen different government departments to do all of the things that the forest used to do. And so now, as we're heading into a more natural response, we're having to de-silo and integrate. And part of our stormwater harvesting systems and things like that are important. And this is just showing, you know, what that loss could look like for us. So Fitzroy Gardens, Royal Parade without elm trees. So you can see loss of one species could be quite devastating for us. And you look at Royal Parade, you could be driving around a motorway. So I think we underestimate the power of trees, their role in the landscape, giving it a human scale, and also the benefits that they provide. Diversity I'll touch on. This is the Canal du Midi in France. And so this runs from Toulouse down to the Mediterranean, and it's a World Heritage Listed landscape, and lots of people take their lovely canal boat holidays up and down it, partly because the French government planted, I think it's 35,000 plane trees a few years ago. They're now removing 35,000 plane trees because of one fungal disease, which is going through, which is being spread by the ropes tying the boats up and breaking through the bark of the trees. So another piece of vulnerability. For us, our CBD has, I think, 75% London plane trees in it. It leaves us vulnerable to pest, to disease, to extremes of weather, to the things that aren't coming through. In Canada is that the pine beetle, I think, has devastated huge natural areas there simply because the overwinter temperatures lifted by about 0.5 degree. So really subtle changes can mean that the beetle that used to die out doesn't die out anymore. So a big part of what we do is around the diversity, and so this is where we've got to with our CBD precinct. We've retained the plain trees. You can see here you've got Swanson, Elizabeth, Burke and Collins, but the rest of the grid we're transforming into different tree species, not actively, but just when one comes out, another one goes in. And so that'll give us, that diversity, which is really important. But also another thing that I'll touch on today is how we connect people to nature and the importance of doing that and the value that comes through to that. And certainly a lot of our conversations with the community have been about a change in what the offer is from a tree nature perspective, and then these are some of the tree species that we're going to be planting through there, and some of the street profiles that we're doing as well. Heritage and science is an interesting one for us. This is Birdwood Avenue on the left, and then this is Fraser Avenue in Kings Park in Perth. And in Birdwood Avenue we had 5 lines of Lombardy poplars, which were planted in 1938. This is the avenue in Kings Park that was planted in 1933. One's being successful, the other one isn't, and so I wanted to get rid of the 5 rows of poplars because they're all dying and replace them with lemon-scented gums. And Heritage Victoria said, no, you're not allowed to, you've got to replace like with like. So an interesting sort of tension. So we ended up taking all of the poplars out, and we planted 2 rows of poplars, and just because it was during the millennium drought, they died. Then I got the lemon-scented gums in, which now looks like this. So it's interesting, the space that you get into, the cultural values are really important, but how do we actually sort of be culturally respectful but scientifically sensible is an interesting one. And that's a few years older. Those lemon-scented gums are taken off and looking absolutely fantastic. In terms of the strategy development, which we released in 2012, this was sort of the key phrase that tries to sort of give a sense of what we're wanting to do, which is to have a city in a forest rather than a forest in a city. So really what it's recognising is that the green infrastructure that comes from the forest is just as important as transport infrastructure, telecommunications. And it means that we want to have a healthy matrix which is connected and it's giving us as much benefit as we possibly can, rather than having a couple of trees here or a park there as an afterthought. So it's really starting to, if you like, mainstream the concept of greening and how important it is in the city. And that sort of concept and being able to get people to conceptualise and have a shared vision for the future is really important in terms of the development of this work. So this is sort of really just going about how we sort of did it. We've got an incredibly sort of multidisciplinary team and reference groups that we use, so academics, but within the team we've got arborists, urban foresters, we've got social scientists, communications experts, etc., because we recognise that urban forestry as a whole doesn't belong to one professional. And so as much as we have siloed government departments, we also have siloed professional thinking. So being able to bring those together has been really key for us to do it. Targets and technical analysis, and really recognising when we set out with the strategy, it wasn't about what species of tree we were going to plant. It was how do we best respond to climate change? How do we best offer greening in our city to underpin health, livability and well-being, and at the same time respecting Melbourne's character? People are really generally afraid of change. And I think about 80% of change management processes fail because you don't take people along on a journey. So part of this was to get us away from where we were, which was a debate about whether we planted a native or exotic tree, to one which says we need to plant more trees, and we need to plant more trees which are going to give us all of the environmental service benefits, irrespective of where they come from. You all know about how good green is. There's no sort of end to the data and knowledge about why it is, whether it's improved recovery in hospital after operations, decreased requirement of medicine, decreased in recidivism, a whole range of things. And I'm just reading a book at the moment which is sort of having a bit of a discussion about the forest bathing in Japan and the research that they do there. So, there's some really interesting stuff that goes on around the world. There's a report I read from Helsinki that looked at bacterial load on people's skin, and people that lived in the country had more bacteria but were healthier. than people that lived in urban areas. So there's no shortage of it. The question that I have, and where I think it's really important for all of us, is how do we translate that knowledge into on-ground outcomes? And how do we do it successfully, and how do we do it with a stewardship lens so that we get a decent run of 10 or 15 years of doing this work? Because if you've got 10 or 15 years, you can transform urban areas. So how do you get the uncontested budgets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? How do you get that ongoing support? And it's challenging because if we're lucky, I've been incredibly fortunate to have this sort of stewardship role for 18 years at the City of Melbourne. But we're still beset by 4-year political terms, and who knows what the hell our politicians are thinking of. We're also sort of run by 12-month financial terms. Does they have their...
It's 12 o'clock.
It's 12 o'clock. But we're sort of in it. So in a sense, local government especially are generally the people of green. The challenge is that we talk about improving health and wellbeing, and so we can cool the city, have cleaner air, so we decrease the budget load on the hospital system. So how do we connect hospital budget to greening? It's making some of those sort of connections. Who do we need to partner with, and how do we move forward? So this is the suite of strategies that we've developed over the last decade. So you can see urban forest strategy and open space strategy we did in 2012. Nature in the City is our ecology strategy, which was released last year. Climate change adaptation refresh we did last year. The Growing Green Guide is about growing green roofs, walls, facades. So it's a how-to guide, a technical guide. And I think we put that up online in 2014 and it's been downloaded something like 150,000 times. So really good sharing of information. So we recognise that we want more green roofs, walls and facades, but the industry sort of is in its infancy. So this is to help that. ZNE is about emissions reduction, and total watermark is really about the water and management of that, so integrated water management. So you can see all of these linked together to cool the city. And so that's sort of been the main catch cry of what we want to do. So the City of Melbourne's main push towards responding to urban heating and climate change is through a green infrastructure lens. And so that's been born of strategies that we've looked at, pieces of work that we've done. One study looked at what was the most cost-effective way to prevent urban heating, and it was simple: plant trees. It's common sense. So how do we actually harness all of that benefit that we know can come through nature? So jumping just to the urban forest strategy, when we released that and worked through with the community, these were the key principles that came through there. So you see, in a sense, there's not a lot about trees in those key principles. So what we're talking about is, if you like, the overall ecology of the city. So everybody agrees to that. So that was a really good starting point. So we then take that and develop what are our particular targets and strategies. So the key one there, the 40% canopy cover by 2040, diversity, vegetation health, soil moisture and water, urban ecology and community. So they're all sort of the key components of the strategic approach that we've got. And they're all sort of quite high level, and there's a lot of detail that goes into those, but that's literally what we've been implementing through our programs since 2012. So I'll just sort of run through a bit of how we've done it and how we think about it. And I talk about city ecology, and this piece of work we did, I think, in 2011 as well. And so this is a heat map which shows surface temperatures at 3 AM after 3 or 4 hot days in the city. And so there it shows you where the city's hot and where it's not. You may recognise Queen Victoria Market car park up the top, MCG down here, etc. And it talks about if we're saying planting trees will cool the city, this tells us where we need to focus. So again, if you think back, 80% of the realm that we own is roadways. So it's much better for us to plant trees to shade a road than it is to plant another tree in a park. So it's about being smart about how we go about doing it. But it also talks, I think, gets people to think differently about the city, because most of us, if you're going into town, you're thinking, which bus or tram or train am I catching? Where's the address of the place that I'm going for lunch? But you look at the city this way and you're thinking, how hot is it? It's slightly it's making us connecting to nature in a way. And And I think design, those of you, I'm not sure if you follow the Australian Open tennis, which occurs in January in Melbourne each year, what's the main topic of conversation? It's the heat. Okay. Where's the Melbourne Tennis Centre?
Smack in the middle of
Right there. That's the hottest part of the city. So jumping back, and the design of the space that we're in is really, really important. And creating spaces that are cool, and if they can support trees and green and soil moisture, all the better. So that's sort of a lot of our work, is to prevent that. And thermal imaging is just a good way to communicate that you get benefits vertically as well as horizontally. And so this is a tree that I use to illustrate a lot of our stuff. This is a London plane which is in Russell Street, just up from Burke Street. And we all know that a big tree gives us 75% more benefits than a small tree, so we'd much rather see something that big compared to a crepe myrtle planted there. It's in the middle of the road, so it's not lifting up pavements, it's not being cleared from the building line, it doesn't have power line clearance going on there. It's got a huge canopy, great leaf area index, healthy compared to the trees up the hill. And then why is it working so well? Simple. Below that artwork used to be an underground toilet. It's an accidental water-sensitive urban design outcome. It's telling us how to go about greening our city. So when we talk about canopy cover, and there's that tree just on a hot day, so you can see, 59.1 degrees in the sun, 31 underneath the shade of the tree. It's a really good way to be able to communicate to people why we should have more green. Use the science. This is looking at it from a canopy perspective, so it's the top tree. So you can see on the left, we've got 5 trees existing, 27% canopy cover. Simply replicating the one tree 3 times, we get over 40% canopy cover through that block. So it's worth remembering that canopy cover isn't about tree numbers. You're much better off planting a smaller number of really big trees, and you will get much, much better outcome and much, much better, and it's easier to manage. We use a lot of graphics about what that difference is going to look like. And so you can see it's palatable. So helping people with change is really, really important. The other thing is soil moisture and water. This is just an unirrigated park. That's a patch of bare dirt down the front. So it's worth remembering that's just as hot as asphalt on a really hot sunny day. So the role of water in all of our landscapes and that transpiration is really critical, really, really important. So some of the stuff that we do, this is one of our first road dieting projects, as we call it. So this is Errol Street Reserve, Errol Street Primary just up the top, so left to right, 500 square metre, roundabout 5,000 square metre park, just by peeling back the asphalt. Unused, we've now got a one-way road system, it's much better for pedestrian movement, there's space for kids, stormwater harvesting, all of that. Cost-wise, if we purchased 5,000 square metres of land at North Melbourne prices at the time, it would have cost us 18 million to do this. It cost us 2 because the road's owned by council. We did have a lot of opposition. We had some people took us to VCAT to stop this going ahead, which I found a little bit strange. Most people like a park outside their house. But anyway, we've done a whole series of those. This is one that we've just started building at the moment. This is South Bank Boulevard. Major road was designed to carry 50,000 vehicles a day. Queensbridge Square closed it off, so it was down to 10,000 a day, so we could reduce it down to 2 lanes, shift those lanes across to the north, 2.5 hectare linear park going into an area which has got the least open space there. $175 million worth of land project will cost us about 40. So that sort of transformation can be done on a lot of different scales, and it's really about what's needed and what isn't needed, and that'll make a significant difference. Touch briefly, just want to talk about the Royal Park Nature Playground. If you know Melbourne, this is the corner of Gatehouse and Flemington Road. The Royal Children's Hospital shifted, so this corner used to be an at-grade car park. And so we went through a process of fairly wide community engagement to realise a new regional play facility there. And one of the things that we did that I really liked was is starting to bring in the caring for country principles that come through our traditional owners, and how we can sort of embed that in our work. And so one of the things that Wurundjeri is our local tribe, so we started to look at their 7-season calendar and how that could incorporate the design and how we think about the land. And it makes sense, we shouldn't be operating on a 4-season European calendar. It doesn't make sense, but you start looking at these and the difference. So we've got wombat season, orchid season, And so we had traditional owners engaging with children, what were the stories that captivated the kids, and that was really enriching, and that then gets embedded into the layout and the design of that space. And it's been probably one of the most successful landscape projects that I've been in. You know, when you start off with a project and you have all of these aspirations for it, this one ticked nearly every box. So the design, and we did that in-house, has all of this fantastic rock work. So all of the developmental ages of children and that next step of challenge that they need are embedded within this. It works all the way up to adults. We did a lot of parkour, people that sort of run through it. We worked with the hospital, and you can see it's integrated quite nicely into the design. Obviously sort of disability access. What was really interesting was that when we did the consultation, we had to purposefully go out really broad because the local people didn't want change there. We had people in Gatehouse Street saying, we don't want children there. We especially don't want disabled children there. And they're quite vocal about that. So how we went about the engagement was really important, because we went out with a blank slate and we literally sort of asked people to help us create an ideas plan, what their values were. And then that went in, that was developed, and then eventually went through to a master plan. But working with the health professionals was really good, and as you can see, a lot of sick children are taken out on a daily basis out there to engage with nature. And a lot of the doctors and nurses that talk about that first interaction with children, which is often quite difficult, will take them out into the park or talk about the park, and helps to break down those barriers and dialogue. So that's been super successful. Future urban forest, this comes back to that earlier comment about what do we plant in the future. And so this was some work that we did with Melbourne Uni and a guy called Dave Kendall, who's now down at UTAS. And so it's really starting to ask, what trees should we be planting for Melbourne's future climate? So we just looked at urban trees around the world and came up with this list for us, and that sort of starts to inform what we're getting grown, either contract grown or working with our botanic gardens to select. But it just sort of works on a traffic light system, which is sort of quite simple to do, and that work's been evolved. This is a growing green guide that I talked about before, which is sort of really good, which we took through to do look at policy options, but then demonstration sites, and we ended up doing a rooftop project, which was exciting, looking at all of the built form in the city for its capacity for green, solar or cool, which we mapped and then made available through our open data platform. And the really interesting thing out of that was this sort of graph here, and especially if you look down the bottom right-hand corner, that figure of 248, so that's 248 hectares. All of our parkland added up together comes to 500 hectares. By roofs, simply having green roofs put on will add an enormous amount to make the city so much greener. And how that sort of translates, and you've heard me talk about understanding the potential. This is the Elizabeth Street catchment, so within our municipal boundary, you may have seen the floods that occurred down the bottom of Elizabeth Street at Flinders Street. We work with Melbourne Water. They currently has an extreme hazard rating, and to stop it, to move it from extreme down to high, we have to hold back 6.8 megalitres of water. If simply 25% of the roofs which could put a green roof on did, we'd hold back close to 30 megalitres of water. And so that's really powerful when you start to look at mandating. You're starting to understand what's the potential, and stopping flooding saves a fortune. You know, it's really, really, really important. We did a similar thing with laneways. We did a pilot of greening laneways. So most of our strategic work covers all of the streets, but laneways, which you might be aware of, sort of famous in Melbourne, we wanted to understand their potential again. So we went out and did some mapping, so solar access, wind. We looked at what's needed for vehicle access for rubbish bin collection, and I think we came up with something like 170 hectares of vertical wall space that's available, and about 60 hectares of ground space that was available. The walls are obviously owned by other people other than council, so we made the information available and then asked people over a 2-week period to nominate if their laneway wanted to join with council and do a greening project. We had over 800 nominations in 2 weeks on 241 laneways. So it's identified the potential within the community to want to band together and work with us. So we ended up doing 4 green laneways, and those are all finished now and looking fantastic, and there's sort of clamouring for more. This is sort of some of the work that we did. So some of it's really simple, just parthenocissus, but well designed and different things. Sometimes it sort of has its downside. This was Albert, and he wanted to join in by doing his garden. Unfortunately, somebody showed this picture to the Lord Mayor, and the Lord Mayor rang me up and said, "Ian, have you just spent $120,000 down at Bunnings buying a few pots?" But it really just sort of shows that sort of capacity that's out there, that's untapped, and why it's so important to combine with the community. And some spaces that weren't available for greening, we did some artwork. We came up with a new design. This was called a sort of a drain garden. So where the downpipe sort of comes out, the designers came up with a way to capture that to create a growing space and clean water and things. So some quite creative things came through that. Science is something that's incredibly important for us, and these are some of the figures that come out of work that we've done with the Water Sensitive City CRC. And so just simple, having the science. So figures like this, 10% increase in canopy cover, 4 degrees C, reduction in the peak in floods. Often you might say, well, look, if you plant trees in New York, this is what happens, and then I'll go back to New York. So it's really important to have local data to back up what you're doing and to substantiate what you do. And so what we try and do is get our city to get back to that natural system. And in a natural forest, 80% of the rainfall is transpired by trees. The other 20% goes into the ground and is cleaned. It's almost the opposite in cities. So 80% of the rainfall gets captured, polluted, and put into pipes. So how do we sort of start to switch that around and start to have a more environmental system? This is Elizabeth Street, so the Elizabeth Street catchment area that I talked about before. So you can see, to stop that flooding is going to make a huge benefit economically to the city. And this is the catchment, the work. You can see the blue line with the flood, but some of the targets that we've put into, what does Elizabeth Street catchment do? How do we change it? You can notice the integration there of permeability of canopy cover, etc., water quality. So we're starting to become quite holistic in the thinking. So it's not just about trees, it's recognising the whole of the forest and the importance of that. Some of the ways that we do it, these are water sensitive urban design tree pits. The one on the left, Ackland Street, South Yarra, we have 2 years of maintenance with each tree that's planted. That one was planted in the middle of the millennium drought, and the tree crews said that they put about 70% less water on that during its maintenance compared to other trees. So, anecdotal plus science talks about how good it is. One of our stormwater harvesting, this is in Darling Street in East Melbourne, and a challenge doing this in built-up areas. A lot of stormwater harvesting systems are open water bodies. So this is all underground, so there's tanks stacked below this, and we tap into Gibbs Street and Grey Street pipes, holding tank through sedimentation traps, pumped up through these rain gardens and then distributed around. So an active pumping system, which is quite good. Anything that's not used goes into stormwater, but it's clean the way that it goes out. Permeability, this is Eads Place in West Melbourne. You can see we did a structural soil trench. Those old elms that we took out. And then this part through here, which structure below that's got porous asphalt over the top. So that's sort of 500 square metres of a porous surface. There's different ways of doing it, different techniques. This is in Collins Street in the city. We've got that civic bluestone, which the engineers love to put on a concrete reinforced slab that's that thick. Trees don't like that much. So we just came up with design this way through. So just back of curb, we've got a structural soil trench with these sets sitting on top and permeability. It was interesting when it was first built, the crew just put normal soil in, so of course all the blocks started to slump, and the Lord Mayor walked past. You've got to be really careful about how you go about doing things and getting it right. So this is now standard treatment in a lot of places. And the engineers stand up and go, aren't we good, look what we do for climate change. A lot of that stuff is on our Urban Water website. So this is really talking about both sort of for laypersons and for technical, all about the learnings. This is one project we did in Fitzroy Gardens. You can see on the left the 5 megalitre tank, and then on the right is what was returned to the community. So that was by cutting the depot in half. and then putting that in. So I think about 70% of the water for Fitzroy Gardens comes through that system that goes through there. So quite valuable, and a new cafe and a new park space for people that we're crying out for, urban water again. Community engagement. So probably the more time that we've spent engaging with the community and developing a partnership, the stronger and the better our work has become. And we did it on a lot of different ways, and we felt it was very important for us to, you know, how do we stop a document being technically brilliant and just sitting on a shelf somewhere? By ownership of everybody that's concerned, by ownership of the community, and our elected officials listen very strongly and closely to the community. So if the community is demanding for it, that's good for us. It's also about how do we understand what the values of the community are? Are we doing the right thing? How do we match those, and how do we embed that there? Because we come from a professional discipline, but as I've sort of said earlier, the community is probably the most important element of the forest. And again, that 70% of our municipality is owned by other people. So how do we engage and empower and get them to want to contribute, and to let them know that they can contribute? And climate change especially was, I think, largely thought of as owned by the labs-coded scientists in Canberra at CSIRO. But it's owned by all of us. We can all respond to it. Enabling and empowering people is a really important thing to do. So we went to a lot of effort to understand and to engage. And if you recall, you know, tree conversations were adversarial, it's native exotic. How do you get it past that? And how do you get past people's short-term thinking to say, no, you can't plant a tree in front of my house, that's where I park my car. You know, how do we get that long-term legacy thinking? And it's by engagement, and it's about conversation, and it's about an honest interaction. So with the IAP2 spectrum, we're up around that collaborating power space. And for a lot of local governments, giving the community the power of decision-making is a very challenging thing. That participatory governance approach is something that's not done easily, but when you do get it right, it makes a huge difference. So we did a whole range of different tools, you know, videos, art and design competitions, a lot of advertising, a lot of different stuff. Following the development of the strategy, we then developed 10 precinct plans. So these are all available online that you can have a look at. And literally we co-designed these with the community. So we went out and asked, what are their values, what do they see? And one of the things that we did was to understand how do they understand the character of their place, and then what do they want the character of their future urban forest to be. So top right down to bottom left, that's the character of Carlton and East Melbourne as they see it now, and then up top and down there is what they want their forest to be. This is a really good way to capture what the community wants and tell our councillors. So as you can see, they want shady, big, beautiful, green, leafy. It's really consistent about what the community is demanding and asking of us. So this is really powerful in that business case that you sort of develop. So it's not purely about return on investment of dollars, it's about what people want and want in the future. And we did things like look at, you know, what's their preference for types of vegetation. So you can see across the 4 areas, really similar. And it's interesting to see colour and flowering is something that people are wanting to see a lot more of. And I think sort of Melbourne's sort of traditionally done green quite well with planes and elms, but now our planting palette is starting to reflect that a lot more. So there's a lot more, and I think that's about that biophilic wanting to connect with nature and seasonality and to experience change. And so that's sort of very strong. So it gets us into spaces like this. These are the vision statements for each of the precinct plans. Those were written by the community. That's not us. So that's what the community wanted the Parkville urban forest to look like in the future. And so that sort of honest reaction with the community is really quite powerful. And for me, I've talked about diversity being really important. And we could sort of sit back and professionally plan and plot what diversity looks like. But by giving the community the power to say what they want, you get diversity naturally. So it's really going to be quite interesting and a very empowering one to go. And so these are some of the ways that we looked at it, and in a sense, this is what takes it beyond being, say, just a tree planting plan. And if you look at all the various layers down on the left, we're starting to understand slope, aspect, soil quality, hydrology, all of the underpinning sort of natural elements of the city to support the greening, as well as the connectivity and people movement path. The thing that struck me the most out of all of those conversations was the desire, strongly expressed desire of the community to work with us. So we started to think of different ways that we could do that, and I wanted to know about more information. And so we created the Urban Forest Visual. And so this is our GIS database of all of our trees put into a public platform. And we worked with a designer, so it sort of looked quite beautiful. And we figured that if people wanted to work with us, we should enable them to connect with us. So you can click on any of these trees and it'll tell you useful life expectancy, species, and a bit of information. But we also gave each tree a unique email address so that people could email the tree and tell us if there was a problem with it. Now, what turned out is that we've just created this extraordinary space where we've had about 4,000 love letters come into our trees. And I thought I'd share a couple with you. So, and by the way, this is the, all those white dots are all the trees that have received emails. But this is the most emailed tree. So this is a big golden elm at the corner of Punt Road and Alexandra Avenue. And this is the most emailed tree in Melbourne. It gets a lot of traffic going past it. What's really valuable about this is that it sits on Vic Road's land. And last year, Vic Roads were looking at doing a project called the Punt Road Widening. They were eyeing off this patch of land. We informed them how popular that tree was, and they changed their design. So there's some tangible power to capturing community values. And they're values that are often left out of big decisions, and especially transport infrastructure. I mean, you might have heard there was a huge stink because they did some traffic widening on the Tullamarine Freeway where it comes into Flemington Road, and they cut down some lemon scented gums. One of those was on the National Trust Significant Tree Register, and that was a huge stink. So that happened before they looked at this spot. So they become a lot more aware of community values. So it's quite good. But the interesting thing is, you know, we've talked about a strong desire for us is to connect the community to nature. And so we do a whole range of different ways of doing that, but probably one of the most effective has been enabling people to email a tree. And if you do some of that sort of reading around that sort of biophilic space and what the forest bathing in Japan, they've shown that people's stress levels drop markedly when they connect to nature. And so this is a way to connect people to nature and to enable them to get into the zone or in the flow, as they say. As we know, if we go out bushwalking after a couple of hours, you're in the space, you're more attentive, you're more creative. And so this has sort of been a kind of a technological way of doing that. And so we've had a myriad of ways of people connecting. You know, this one's about knowing that these trees are going to leave soon. So it's enabling people to grieve about the loss of something that's going to occur, which is something we've sort of talked about a bit. And then we decided that if the email was interesting enough, then the tree might want to write back. So this is a dialogue between somebody, Jamie, who's written into the tree, and he wanted to call the tree Dale instead of Chinese L10305595. And if you read the content there, it's that very typical Australian conversation about hydration and dehydration. So, you know, what do you do over the weekend? And the thing that I like the most, you get down to the bottom, and of course he's asking the tree to drop a branch on a Collingwood football player's head. So it's a classic, but we're doing a bit of work at the moment with Wollongong Uni and Melbourne Uni into actually understanding and unpacking that space a bit, because some of them have been quite rich. So it's really interesting. The other thing that we've just launched is our Urban Forest Fund. And this is a piece of work, again, to get us engaged in the private realm. So literally what it is, we've bankrolled a sum of money. We've got, I think, $1.3 million sitting there. And what we do is match dollar for dollar with proposals for greening in the private realm. And so we hope to grow that to about $10 to $20 million over the next decade to leverage and get greening occurring through there. We've just gone, I think we're opening up at the end of the month for round 2. But this is one of the successful round 1 projects. So this is a residential apartment setting. These are just the renders that were part of their submission. So 48 apartments and these are some of the things that they've sort of done. It's about a $200,000 total greening to occur within there. It gives public realm access, etc. So you can see it's transforming the space that it's in there. We've got another one that's just going through a planning scheme at the moment, which is looking at quite a large urban agriculture on top of a car park, so we're hoping that we can announce that one soon. But this is sort of a really good way to do that. Nature in the City is our latest work on ecology, and one of the interesting projects and things that we found when we started to do this work, we went to all the ecologists and said, well, what is there that exists in Melbourne? And nobody knew. So we've gone through and done a whole series of what we call bioblitzes, where we use citizen science to go out and map what's around, and we use specifics like these guys to do work. So they studied 30 insects, and then they converted the work and the study and the research into a children's book, which is sort of that really nice add value, and this one's out and about now, so it's great. Kids love having a look at this going through. We've just done a project called our City's Little Gems, which is looking at butterfly interactions, and this website has just gone up and gone live now. So we looked at a whole range of places about what butterflies were around, and then what plants were they attracted to. So that starts to inform sort of what we do, and basic sort of information. So it's starting to, it does what we often refer to as make the invisible visible. And especially with sort of nature, there's a lot of things that we don't know, whether it's microbats or strange things. Like last night I was walking my dog down the beach and I saw a water rat. It was the first time I'd actually seen one down there. So it's sort of really nice to do stuff like that. So this work is around, and you can sort of click in and go onto particular spots and understand what's there and what they like, if you want to plant things. Citizen Forester program, we've got about 400 citizen foresters signed up that go out and do work for us, so another vehicle coming out of the interaction, and that program is fantastic for us to go out and to understand and to do studies that we normally perhaps wouldn't be able to, and to engage with the community. Latest bit of work, Green Our City Strategic Action Plan. It's a bit of a strange name. Really one of the key elements that comes out of this is to do a planning scheme amendment for mandating greening in the private realm. And so we're in developing a business case on that at the moment, and working with the property council, developers and everybody to come up with what's a really good recipe for Melbourne. You see it happening around the world. Denver recently sort of did one, New York's done one recently. So we studied a few cities around the world to go, which are the greenest ones and why are they green? And basically it's because of regulation. We've been through and we've done advocacy, exemplars, incentivisation, and we're now getting into that mandating or regulation space. So that'll be, hopefully a piece of work that sort of really conjures up success for us. We do a lot of work through communication and sort of the Melbourne brand. So our summer campaign was the New Cool. It's talking to the community about it's getting hot. We need to keep the city cool, so empowering. So it's how we sort of message. And you can see there on Young and Jackson, sort of the big, huge billboard that was up there. Other work that we do outside the city, some of you may be familiar with the work that we did with 2020 Vision, how to grow an urban forest, and we've had masterclasses going around Australia, so that advocacy is a really strong part of what we do. This is the work that Dave Kendall and the Call Hub did, which talks about risks to urban forests. So this is really worth having a look at. So this is for Sydney. So really what it's sort of telling you is that if we don't do anything about it, then 49% of the species that are currently grown aren't going to be suitable in the future. That's really frightening stuff. And so how do we take that knowledge and actually start to look up the resilience through there? And you can sort of see the different scenarios that come through. And this is Marrickville. And again, that's 58% fall into that sort of red category. So that information is really quite concerning. So how do we actually take it? And the critical thing is that temperature is the most limiting factor for tree health and healthy tree growth. And a lot of species have a very limited plasticity when it comes to the range that they operate in. And whilst this is very broad brush, and we can do a lot around microclimate modification, a whole range of other things, I think it's worth knowing, and I think we should look up, what was that species that we were talking about, Quillan? Crepe myrtle. I wonder how that goes on this. But what is it that we should be planting? And, because we don't want trees that are drought tolerant or just resilient or hang in.
It's green.
It's green.
It's all
That's
green.
right, bugger.
There you go.
Then, you know, we want trees that are huge big water plants, you know, that are healthy and alive, because we don't know what pests and disease are coming through. A piece of work that we're doing with the City of Melbourne team, one of their flagship actions is to develop up a metropolitan urban forest strategy. So this covers 32 municipalities in Melbourne, and it's a really good piece of work. But when you look at why they're doing it, that's quite interesting, because it's talking about the stresses and the shocks. And so you've got climate change, ecosystem services, ageing population, shocks, floods, droughts, etc. So that strategy is designed to respond to those. So it's a really important sort of parameter around what we want to do. What was interesting when the Resilient Melbourne team went out and asked the 32 municipalities what were the most important things for them to do and to develop together, you'll see on the left, Metropolitan Urban Forest Strategy, Integrated Water Management. So all the stuff we're talking about, the most highly valued by those 32 councils. So it shows the recognition and the support's there for this work. So how do we enable others to do it? One of the ways is that we've banded together with University of Melbourne to develop the Australian School of Urban Forestry, which is a week-long course which is operating in November this year. From the 11th to the 16th, and this is sort of roughly what the program's going to look like. So we have a series of interactive case studies, and days sort of divided up into three areas, and then the various teams will come back and do their case study presentations. And so this is sort of modelled on, we used to do a School of Parks Management, and so this is something that we've got going. So basically it's for professionals that come down, so I'd encourage any of you who are interested to have a look. It's only about $3,500 for a week. You have to provide your own accommodation. But we've got a really good suite of speakers, and I think the networking and the learnings from each other are going to be really fantastic. So there'll be a range of professionals that come in. Now if I can see if I can get this to work, this is sort of a draft. No, not going to work. Enter. No, it's not going to work. It was just a video to entice you more. But anyway, the other thing that I sort of sometimes talk about is what's our role and how do we connect. And I used to do a bit of work with this fellow called James Hitchmore, who, if you looked at the wildflower meadow that was done around the London Olympic Stadium, he was my master's supervisor. And so we still did a bit of work, but he always used to say that what we need to be is purveyors of delight. And in a way, it's a really truthful thing that whilst we talk about the environmental services and what have you, how we actually, you know, think about connecting people and what is it that we want to provide, we need to make it attractive for everybody. And we did a wildflower meadow in at Exhibition Street Extension at Birrong Ma, and we just done a stormwater harvesting. We had 3,000 square metres of bare dirt, and so rather than turfing it, we thought, let's do a wildflower meadow. And that's probably one of the things which has brought the most response to council from any horticultural intervention that we've done. And as you can see, it looked absolutely stunning. And what was sort of interesting on February the 14th, we lost most of the flowers about a metre back from the curb. It was Valentine's Day. But we had people having their wedding photos taken in it and all sorts of things. And it was interesting too, because I thought, now, what was it about that was so appealing? And obviously it looks beautiful, but I think it's partly because there's a wildness to it. And I think, you know, we need to advance people on from neatly manicured horticulture. And I think if you get into that sort of biophilic lens about this sort of desire to connect to nature, we have down in Victoria, we have these myths about the cougars that were left over from the Second World War from the American airmen that were found, and people keep seeing these cougars, but they never see any scats or any tracks or anything. So part of it is, I think, just people's imagination wanting to connect to wildness and to wilderness. And so I think this is partly to do with that as well. So I think it's important, and it's why we go trekking in the desert. That's why we want to immerse ourselves in nature. It's because that's important to us. So how do we provide that in a built environment? And a couple of people, if you want to read further, people like Bill McDonald and Tim Beatley are very much around how do we have nature at the heart of the design of what we do. And I think it's important to remember that we're actually creating spaces for people, and what is it that people want, and how can they use them, and how can we get multiple benefits out of any space that we actually create. I think it's important for us to recognise that we don't have to plant 35 crepe myrtles down each side of the street. We can actually do something different. You know, we need to be adventurous, and we need to think about how we bring in Pinus Pioneer into the heart of the city. That's in Rome. You know, don't you just love showing a holiday photo in your presentation? And this is Vienna. This is Hundertwasser's work. But I think just that it's increasingly important for us now, as you know, what the World Health Organization now has qualified us as urban people. We used to be rural people. There's now more people living in urban centres than there were in rural centres. We're bombarded by technology and information, and it's stressing the crap out of us. How do we connect people to nature to make us healthy in our health and well-being? It's by connecting people to nature and doing it in lots of different ways. Thank you.